Think your morning commute is rough? Your ancestors from just 1,000 years ago would laugh at what you consider hardship. Let's imagine you've been transported to a coastal Viking settlement circa 850 CE. Your survival clock starts now. You awaken before dawn in a smoke-filled longhouse on a straw-filled sack crawling with fleas and lice, already feasting on your skin. The temperature hovers just above freezing as the hearth fire died down hours ago. Your only climate control, layers of rough-spun wool that feels like sandpaper. That persistent itch is just the beginning of what could become infected sores without proper treatment. But here's the part no one saw coming. Your morning routine doesn't involve scrolling through social media. There's no bathroom to stumble into, no hot shower to wash away your grogginess. Instead, you'd venture outside in pre-dawn darkness to relieve yourself in a designated area that's uncomfortably close to living quarters. Toilet paper? Non-existent. Think moss, leaves, or smooth stones instead. And that minty fresh feeling would be replaced with scraping your teeth using a frayed twig, maybe with some abrasive ashes if you're fancy. Your mouth would still taste foul because, bacterially speaking, it probably is. Breakfast offers no comfort either, just a bowl of reheated barley gruel, perhaps with bits of intensely salty preserved fish. The water looks suspicious, teeming with microorganisms your pampered immune system has never met. One sip could mean dysentery within hours. Even the morning ale, safer than water, would taste sour and flat to your modern palate. By now your body is in revolt, caffeine withdrawal, headaches pounding, stomach questioning your choices, joints aching from your medieval sleeping arrangement. But there's no calling in sick in Viking society. No paid time off. Unless you're physically incapacitated, you work. Morning labour won't involve emails or meetings, but back-breaking physical tasks. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending animals, or agricultural work that would leave your soft hands blistered before midday. And if you think that's bad, just wait. All this assumes your settlement isn't under attack. Vikings lived where violence wasn't a distant threat, but everyday reality. The morning calm could shatter instantly with approaching enemies, leaving seconds to react in a world where combat wasn't optional, but essential. Your knowledge of spreadsheets won't help you wield an axe against someone who's been training since childhood. In Viking times, being unprepared for violence wasn't just a disadvantage, it was a death sentence. You've made it to midday, your modern muscles screaming in protest from the morning's labour. Now comes what should be a relief, mealtime. But if you're anticipating a comforting lunch break, you're in for another brutal awakening. Viking sustenance was about survival, not satisfaction, and the distance between their food practices and your local bistro spans more than just centuries. The midday meal, if you're fortunate, consists of more of that morning gruel, though perhaps with additions that would make your modern stomach turn. Imagine biting into bread so coarse and gritty it wears down your teeth with every chew. The grain wasn't just minimally processed, it often contained particles of millstone. That strange tang, not artisanal sourdough culture, but the early stages of mold that couldn't be wasted in a society where starvation loomed every winter. The meat, when available, wouldn't be the neatly trimmed portions from your grocery store, but tough, stringy cuts from animals that lived hard lives, often preserved through smoking or brining to a saltiness that would make your blood pressure skyrocket. If you're squeamish about looking your dinner in the eye, Viking cuisine would be your personal nightmare. Nothing, absolutely nothing, goes to waste. Blood collected from slaughtered animals becomes the base for black pudding. Organs that modern Americans discard are prized delicacies. That stew bubbling in the pot might contain sheep's head, complete with eyes that are considered particularly nutritious. And let's not even discuss what passes for sausage casings. Your modern sensibilities about food would mark you as wasteful at best, possibly insulting to your hosts at worst. You're probably wondering how anyone could possibly stay properly nourished on such fare. The truth is, many didn't. Seasonal vitamin deficiencies were common, especially in winter and spring when fresh produce was non-existent. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums and reopening of old wounds, was a regular visitor to Viking communities before spring greens emerged. That slightly nauseating fermented fish you're being offered, it's not just a delicacy, it's survival, providing precious nutrients during the barren months when fresh food is impossible to find. Your reluctance to eat it might be the difference between life and death when winter stretches longer than expected. And then there's the constant uncertainty. Modern humans have forgotten what true food insecurity feels like. Your Viking hosts live with the knowledge that one bad harvest, one cattle disease, one lengthy storm preventing fishing vessels from launching could mean starvation for the entire community. The food storage areas aren't just conveniences, they're survival chambers, carefully managed and fiercely protected. That anxiety about food sufficiency permeates every aspect of Viking life, creating a relationship with sustenance entirely foreign to your supermarket psychology. In their world, the luxury of being a picky eater doesn't exist. Unless you're among the settlement's elite, portions are determined by your value to the community. That scrawny kid getting a larger share than you, he's the blacksmith's apprentice, essential to the community's survival. Your modern indignation about fairness in food distribution would be met with blank stares or outright hostility. In Viking society, your worth is measured in practical contribution, not abstract notions of equality. And if food becomes truly scarce, those deemed least valuable eat last, if at all. If you've managed to choke down enough unfamiliar food to keep moving, your survival clock continues ticking into the afternoon. But in Viking society, the greatest threat to your continued existence isn't the food or the working conditions. It's other humans. The popular image of Vikings as warriors isn't just historical stereotyping. It reflects a fundamental truth about their world where violence wasn't an aberration, but a constant companion. Let's be uncomfortably honest. You, the modern human, have probably never experienced true violence. Maybe you've seen a bar fight or witnessed a heated argument, but the visceral life or death combat that was commonplace in Viking society, that's as foreign to you as smartphones would be to them. From childhood, Vikings were conditioned not just to accept violence, but to excel at it. Boys as young as 12 trained with weapons daily, not as sport, but as essential life preparation. That teenager carrying an axe isn't playing at being an adult. He's already expected to defend the settlement if raiders appear on the horizon. And those raiders weren't rare occurrences, but a persistent reality. Coastal settlements lived in perpetual readiness for attack, not just from rival Viking groups, but from anyone with a boat and desperation or greed as motivation. The concept of peace as we understand it, the default state occasionally interrupted by conflict, would be reversed in Viking consciousness. Potential conflict was the default, with periods of relative calm as the welcome exception. Your modern instinct to flee from danger rather than toward it would mark you as a liability in a world where every able body was expected to grab a weapon when the alarm sounded. But you know what's worse than the external threats? The internal ones. That seemingly friendly Viking who shared his ale with you this morning. He's measuring your worth, your weakness, your potential usefulness. Disputes between community members weren't settled through passive-aggressive emails or HR interventions, but through direct confrontation, often escalating to holmgang, a form of regulated duel used to settle everything from property disputes to insults. Your modern conflict avoidance strategies would be interpreted as weakness, making you a target rather than keeping you safe. That's if you're a man. If you're a woman, different but equally brutal rules apply. While Viking women had more rights than many of their contemporaries in other societies, physical strength and willingness to use violence remained cultural currencies. Female Vikings needed to defend themselves and their property when men were away raiding, creating a society where even women possessed combat skills that would humble most modern men. Your inability to wield a shield or knife with confidence would make you vulnerable regardless of your gender. Even social gatherings contain potential death sentences for the unwary modern human. Those drinking horns being passed around the evening fire aren't filled with light beer, but potent mead or ale, consumed in quantities that would incapacitate the untrained modern liver. Yet maintaining awareness remains essential, because intoxication doesn't excuse you from the complex social rules governing honor and insult. One misinterpreted comment, one cultural faux pas, and you could find yourself facing a very sober Viking demanding satisfaction for an offense you didn't even realize you committed, and refusing such a challenge. That's not avoiding conflict. It's guaranteeing your status as a social outcast, denied the community protection that stands between survival and death. If you've survived the violence and managed not to fatally offend anyone, you're now facing the microscopic world of disease and infection that decimated pre-modern populations. Vikings lacked not just antibiotics, but the entire framework of germ theory that protects you daily. That small cut from afternoon chores. In your world, it's a minor inconvenience. In Viking Norway, it's potentially fatal. Without antibiotics, even tiny injuries frequently developed into life-threatening infections. The reddening skin around that cut isn't just inflammation. It's possibly the beginning of blood poisoning that can kill within days. Viking herbal treatments against serious infection were like fighting forest fires with water pistols. The sanitation situation is equally dire. Viking settlements had designated waste areas, but nothing approaching modern standards. Human and animal waste accumulated near living spaces, creating perfect breeding grounds for parasites and disease. Those stomach cramps might be from intestinal worms that would constitute a public health emergency today. Treatment? More suspicious ale while your body fights a battle it's never trained for. Despite stereotypes of filthy barbarians, Vikings actually valued cleanliness more than many European contemporaries. Cold comfort, considering what that meant. Your communal bath would involve sharing water with multiple family members, perhaps with herbs for scent rather than sanitization. And that throbbing toothache? Dental care consisted primarily of extraction without anesthesia, using tools more suited to a torture chamber. Healing fell to the community's wise women or men, whose treatments blended practical herbalism with rituals that would seem entirely superstitious today. Question this approach, and you're rejecting the cosmological framework ordering their world. By nightfall, new symptoms emerge from your Viking day. Smoke from the hearth has left your eyes irritated, your lungs burning with each breath. The unfamiliar bacterial environment has your stomach churning and skin breaking out in mysterious rashes. Your blistered hands already show signs of infection. In your time, each condition warrants medical attention. Here, there's simply baseline existence, unremarkable to anyone but you. As darkness falls on your first, possibly last, day in Viking society, you confront perhaps the most relentless opponent, the Nordic environment itself. These people survived not because their environment was forgiving, but because they possessed generations of knowledge that you entirely lack. In Scandinavian winter, your situation would be immediately dire. Modern humans experience cold by choice and in controlled doses. Vikings experienced it as an existential threat requiring constant management. The evening temperature isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Your body, accustomed to central heating and technical fabrics, can't regulate temperature efficiently here. That uncontrollable shivering, it's the first stage of hypothermia. Your provided clothing, rough wool and animal skins, is drastically different from anything you've worn. The wool retains warmth even when wet, crucial in damp Nordic climate, but irritates skin accustomed to cotton. Those drafty seams aren't manufacturing defects, but the limits of hand stitching. Your constant fidgeting marks you as someone lacking the mental discipline to accept physical discomfort as default. Even in summer, you'd face different but equally challenging conditions. Extended northern daylight would disrupt your circadian rhythms, causing sleep deprivation. The sudden insect profusion would introduce pathogens your body has never encountered. Those picturesque landscapes, filled with hazards requiring experienced navigation, your city-trained eyes would miss crucial environmental indicators that Viking children recognize instinctively. Summer also means brutal work schedules that your 40-hour workweek body isn't prepared for. Vikings worked until daylight or the task was exhausted, up to 16-hour days of continuous physical labor. Your concept of work-life balance would be incomprehensible in a society where survival required maximizing every productive moment. The resulting exhaustion would impact your cognitive function, making errors likely precisely when they could be fatal. As night falls, environmental challenges transform rather than diminish. The seemingly sturdy longhouse reveals its vulnerabilities. Wind finds every construction gap. The necessary smoke hole allows in precipitation. The fire creates heat zones, requiring knowledge of optimal sleeping positions you lack. And the darkness is complete in a way few modern humans ever experience, filled with sounds your urban-trained ears cannot properly interpret. As your first Viking day ends, you face perhaps the most subtle yet inescapable challenge, navigating a social structure operating on entirely foreign principles. Vikings didn't just live differently, they thought differently, valuing concepts that would bewilder modern sensibilities. Your life in a society that at least honors equality, theoretical social mobility, and individual rights would clash with Viking reality. Their world operated on a rigid hierarchy where worth came from birth, strength, and practical contribution, not education or credentials. Your degree, worthless. Your personal brand, meaningless. Your assets back home, non-existent. In one day, you've fallen from whatever status you held to the absolute bottom. A useless outsider with no family connections, no demonstrable skills, and no survival knowledge. The depth of this reset is profound. In Viking society, slaves were property, not people. Without demonstrating immediate value, you'd be somewhere between tolerated burden and potential thrall. That Viking who showed basic kindness? It might have been assessing your market value if you need to be sold to another settlement. Gender roles would further shock your sensibilities. While Viking women had more rights than many contemporaries, clear labor divisions existed. Men showing interest in female tasks faced ridicule. Women who couldn't efficiently manage household production were failing their core social function. Your awkward attempts at gender-appropriate activities would mark you as deficient, regardless of your sex. Even casual interactions are minefields. Viking communication valued directness over diplomacy, unlike your workplace politeness. Your constructive feedback would seem weak and evasive. Your respectful disagreement would read as confusion or cowardice, and humor to diffuse tension. Comedy doesn't translate across millennia, and your clever reference might be taken as a grave insult. Religious views present perhaps the most dangerous territory. Viking spirituality wasn't optional, but a fundamental framework explaining everything from weather to illness. Religious rituals weren't cultural activities, but essential functions ensuring divine favor. Your reluctance to participate wouldn't be respected as personal choice, but condemned as endangering the settlement's relationship with survival-controlling forces. By the time you return to your flea-infested pallet, your social isolation becomes clear. You lack not just physical skills, but the entire cultural framework for functioning in this society. The subtle cues and shared references you navigate effortlessly at home are replaced by equally complex but different ones everyone else understands instinctively. In a world where communal support isn't just socially desirable but essential for survival, being the perpetual outsider isn't just lonely, it's potentially fatal. The painful truth is this: you wouldn't last 24 hours in Viking times, because survival then required an entirely different skill set than modern life has given you. From the moment you woke on that uncomfortable straw mattress to your final, exhausted collapse at night's end, every aspect of Viking existence would be testing capabilities you've never developed. Yet somehow, these fierce northerners not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would break most of us within a single day. What were their secrets? In our next video, we'll discover the forgotten survival tactics Vikings employed that weren't just clever, but essential adaptations forged through generations of harsh experience. Vikings, terrifying Norse warriors, have dominated our imagination for over a millennium. Dragon-proud longships cutting through fog-shrouded waters, battle-hardened raiders descending on unsuspecting monasteries, their very name becoming synonymous with maritime terror. But here's where our neat historical narrative hits a snag, one that most people never hear about. Even the Vikings had waters they dared not enter. In the eastern Baltic, something darker lurked. Meet the Curonians, the sea raiders that history somehow forgot to mention in the same breath as Vikings, despite striking fear into Norse hearts for centuries. These weren't some minor coastal tribes scraping by on fishing and petty theft. The Curonians controlled the Courland Peninsula, a strategic stretch of Baltic coastline covering what we now call Western Latvia and parts of Lithuania. From their base along this windswept shore, they commanded one of the most lucrative and dangerous positions in medieval Europe, the intersection of major trade routes between Scandinavia, Russia, and the Germanic territories. But calling them simple pirates would be like calling a wolf just another dog. The Curonians had evolved into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. They operated a maritime empire built on three pillars: raiding, trading, and slave-taking. And they'd perfected all three to a degree that made even Viking chieftains take notice. What made the Curonians particularly unsettling was their dual nature. One day, they might engage in perfectly legitimate trade negotiations with Swedish merchants, exchanging amber and furs for silver and iron. The next day, those same merchants might find themselves fleeing Curonian war parties, bent on capturing them for the slave markets of Kiev or Constantinople. This unpredictability created a psychological weapon almost as powerful as their actual ships and spears. The Curonians understood something that many other Baltic peoples missed. The sea wasn't just a highway for trade, it was a hunting ground. While other groups focused on defending their territories or establishing permanent settlements, the Curonians perfected the art of maritime predation. They turned the Baltic's complex geography of islands, shoals, and hidden channels into their personal maze, where they could appear and disappear at will. Unlike the agricultural communities that dotted most of the Baltic coast, Curonian settlements were essentially naval bases. Every able-bodied man was expected to serve on the ships. Their children grew up learning to read currents and winds before they could properly read runes. Their women often managed the complex logistics of outfitting expeditions and processing the wealth that flowed back from successful raids. And warfare was not merely a means of acquiring glory or settling disputes. It was a business. Curonian raids were carefully planned operations with specific objectives, detailed intelligence gathering, and sophisticated risk assessment. They studied their targets, learned their weaknesses, and struck with surgical precision. This wasn't the berserker fury of Viking warfare. This was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective. The Vikings, despite all their maritime prowess, had never encountered anything quite like this. Norse raiders were accustomed to inspiring fear, not feeling it. They were used to being the wolves, not the sheep. But in the labyrinthine waters of the eastern Baltic, the Curonians had created conditions where even the most experienced Viking crews found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and very much out of their depth. The secret to Curonian dominance lay in a single, devastating advantage. They had engineered their entire naval strategy around the Baltic's most treacherous characteristic, its deceptively shallow waters. While Viking longships were marvels of engineering designed for deep-water ocean crossings and river navigation, they had a fatal flaw in Baltic coastal warfare. These vessels, typically drawing 2 to 3 feet of water when fully loaded, were simply too deep for the intricate shallow water combat that defined Eastern Baltic conflicts. The Curonians, however, had spent generations perfecting vessels that could operate in water barely knee-deep. Their ships, which archaeologists believe were precursors to the later cog design, featured revolutionary shallow draft hulls that could navigate in as little as 18 inches of water. This wasn't just a minor technical advantage, it was a complete game changer. Imagine being a Viking raider, confident in your superior seamanship, only to watch enemy vessels seemingly glide across waters where your own ships would run aground within minutes. But the Curonians didn't stop at ship design. They had transformed the Baltic's geography itself into a weapon system. The eastern Baltic coast is a maze of over 2,000 islands, countless hidden reefs, and shifting sandbars that can trap unwary vessels for days. What looked like navigational nightmares to outsiders were highways to the Curonians. They had mapped every channel, memorized every tide pattern, and could navigate these waters in conditions that would terrify even experienced Norse pilots. Consider the tactical implications. A Viking raiding fleet approaching Curonian territory would find themselves forced into predictable deep water channels, essentially announcing their arrival hours in advance. Meanwhile, Curonian scout vessels could shadow them from parallel shallow channels, completely invisible to their targets. When the moment came to strike, Curonian ships could attack from directions that seemed impossible, emerging from waters the Vikings considered unnavigable. Their intimate knowledge of local weather patterns provided another crucial edge. The Baltic's notorious sudden storms, which could transform calm seas into ship-killing tempests within hours, were less random to those who understood the signs. Curonian navigators could read wind shifts, cloud formations, and wave patterns with supernatural precision. They would deliberately time their attacks for moments when approaching weather would trap enemy fleets in exposed positions. Even more unsettling was their mastery of seasonal warfare. The Baltic's extreme seasonal variations, from summer's endless daylight to winter's months of darkness, created opportunities that the Curonians exploited ruthlessly. Winter raids were particularly terrifying, as Curonian warriors could use the cover of polar night to approach completely undetected, striking sleeping settlements with devastating effectiveness. Their weapons technology reflected this specialized approach to coastal warfare. While Vikings favored axes and swords designed for close combat on ship decks, Curonians developed spears and javelins optimized for fighting in shallow water and marshy terrain. They perfected the use of crossbows, relatively rare in Scandinavia, but devastatingly effective for picking off enemies from concealed positions among the reeds and islands. The morning of August 15th, 1187, should have been just another successful Viking raid. A Danish fleet under King Canute VI had swept into the Baltic, targeting what they assumed would be easy pickings along the Curonian coast. These weren't inexperienced raiders. Many had participated in successful expeditions to England and Ireland. They knew their business. By evening, the survivors would be rowing desperately back toward Danish waters, their fleet decimated and their king barely escaping with his life. The attack began like so many others. The Danish ships had positioned themselves offshore at dawn, preparing to launch their assault on a Curonian settlement. But as they moved into attack formation, something went wrong. Ships that had been sailing in deep water suddenly found themselves scraping bottom on hidden sandbars. The Curonians had somehow manipulated the very seabed, using their knowledge of shifting sands to create underwater traps. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a systematic destruction. Curonian vessels materialized from channels the Danes hadn't even noticed, attacking the immobilized ships from impossible angles. Danish warriors, trained for conventional ship-to-ship combat, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage on familiar terms. Instead of the expected boarding actions and axe battles, They faced a rain of crossbow bolts from concealed positions and coordinated ramming attacks from vessels that seemed to dance across the water. But the Curonians weren't interested in simply sinking Danish ships. They were capturing them. More specifically, they were capturing the crews alive. For Vikings, who expected to die gloriously in battle, the prospect of being taken alive was far worse than death. It meant slavery, ransom, or ritual sacrifice, fates that stripped them of dignity and denied them any form of warrior's end. The psychological impact of this defeat rippled throughout Scandinavia. Suddenly, Baltic expeditions were no longer guaranteed profit ventures. Swedish and Danish kings found themselves having to offer significantly higher rewards to recruit crews willing to risk Curonian waters. Some experienced raiders simply refused to sail east of Gotland, considering it too dangerous, regardless of potential rewards. The Curonians had achieved something remarkable. They had made the Vikings afraid of the sea. This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical records, though frustratingly sparse, contain references to multiple Viking defeats in Curonian waters. The 1198 expedition that resulted in the capture of several prominent Norwegian jarls. The devastating ambush of 1203 that wiped out an entire Swedish raiding fleet near modern-day Liepāja. The mysterious disappearance of Olaf Tryggvason's advance scouts in 999, which some historians believe was orchestrated by Curonian intelligence networks. Each defeat followed a similar pattern. Confident Viking forces entering what they assumed were familiar waters, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to control the very elements. The Curonians had turned the Baltic into their personal arena, where superior seamanship, local knowledge, and tactical innovation could overcome traditional Viking advantages in weapons and warrior culture. Perhaps most unsettling of all was how the Curonians treated their victories. Unlike Vikings, who celebrated their conquests in elaborate sagas and boastful poems, the Curonians remained mysteriously quiet about their successes. This silence was itself a weapon. Vikings never knew when or where the next attack might come, creating a persistent anxiety that followed Norse expeditions throughout the eastern Baltic. What truly set the Curonians apart wasn't just their ability to defeat Vikings in battle. It was what they did with their captives afterward. While most medieval warriors viewed prisoners as either ransom opportunities or additional mouths to feed, the Curonians had developed an industrial-scale slave trading operation that stretched from the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. The numbers alone tell a chilling story. Historical records suggest that during the height of their power, Curonian slave markets processed thousands of captives annually. But these weren't random raids for human cargo. This was a precisely orchestrated business model that targeted specific types of prisoners based on market demand hundreds of miles away. Vikings, with their reputation as fierce warriors and skilled craftsmen, commanded premium prices in the slave markets of Kiev, Constantinople, and Cairo. A captured Viking jarl could be worth more than an entire season's worth of traditional raids. This economic reality transformed every Viking expedition into a potential treasure hunt for Curonian raiders. They weren't just fighting to defend their territory, they were actively hunting some of the most valuable human commodities in medieval Europe. The Curonians had perfected a capture and processing system that would have impressed Roman slavers. Temporary holding facilities dotted the Courland coast, designed to keep large numbers of prisoners alive and healthy during the sorting process. The most valuable captives, nobles, skilled craftsmen, and young warriors were separated for long-distance transport to premium markets. Others were sold locally or put to work in Curonian settlements. But here's what made this particularly psychological warfare. The Curonians deliberately publicized the fates of their high-profile captives. Word would filter back to Scandinavia about prominent Vikings spotted in slave markets from Novgorod to Baghdad. A Danish noble captured in 1195 was reportedly seen years later serving as a galley slave on Byzantine ships. Swedish warriors taken in coastal raids appeared in the retinues of wealthy Arab merchants. This wasn't just about the economic value of slaves, it was psychological warfare. The prospect of ending up in chains thousands of miles from home, serving foreign masters who didn't even speak their language, was a fate that shattered Viking pride. The Curonians even developed specialized capture techniques designed to take prisoners alive rather than kill them outright. They used nets, weighted ropes, and coordinated grappling tactics that focused on disabling rather than destroying enemy crews. Their ships carried extra provisions specifically for transporting captives, and their raiders trained extensively in non-lethal combat methods. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained detailed records of their captives, essentially inventory management for human cargo. Bone artifacts found in Curonian settlements include what appear to be tally markers, possibly used to track prisoners by origin, condition, and market value. This level of organization indicates a slave trade operation that rivaled anything seen in medieval Europe. The psychological impact extended beyond individual captives. Viking communities lived in constant fear that their men might not just die in battle, but disappear entirely into the vast slave networks that stretched across Eurasia. Families had no way of knowing whether missing warriors were dead or suffering in bondage thousands of miles away. This uncertainty created a unique form of trauma that traditional Viking culture was unprepared to handle. Here's one of history's most revealing silences: the Viking sagas, those epic tales glorifying Norse victories and heroic deaths, barely mention the Curonians. For a culture obsessed with martial glory, that absence speaks volumes. Viking sagas weren't objective records. They were cultural propaganda reinforcing Norse identity. Glorious deaths, always included, but defeats at the hands of Baltic tribes, quietly erased. Other enemies like Anglo-Saxons or Franks appear even in defeat, so long as it looked heroic. But the Curonians offered no such narrative. Vikings captured, outmaneuvered, or enslaved didn't fit the mold. The few mentions, troubles in eastern waters, are vague, as if the truth was too painful to record. Practical reasons played a role too. Viking raids were funded ventures. Admitting crushing losses in Curonian waters risked future investments. Silence became strategy. It went deeper than pride. Viking society was built on the myth of martial superiority. Their economy, religion, and social order all depended on it. Acknowledging repeated defeats would unravel the foundation. But cracks emerged during the Northern Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries. Christian chroniclers now had reason to detail Curonian resistance, framing them as pagans to be conquered. These accounts, ironically, revealed just how advanced Curonian warfare had become. Crusading armies with superior tech still struggled for decades to break their defenses. Even then, Viking-era losses remained buried. It was easier to reframe the conflict as a righteous crusade than admit Scandinavia's greatest warriors had once feared these Baltic raiders. Imagine falling asleep while your breath turns to frost in the air. No heaters, no blankets fresh out of a dryer, just negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit of unforgiving Nordic winter closing in on all sides every single night. While we panic at a broken thermostat, these legendary seafarers mastered the brutal cold using nothing but clever design, communal smarts, and sheer willpower, building an empire from within the ice. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Their homes weren't crude shelters, but finely tuned climate systems disguised as wooden buildings. Their sleep wasn't a gamble with frostbite, it was engineered resilience. As we face a future full of climate uncertainty and rising energy demands, their ancient cold weather strategies might hold more answers than you'd expect. The winter that faced Viking communities wasn't simply cold. It was an existential threat that demanded respect and preparation on a community-wide scale. In coastal Scandinavia, winter temperatures regularly plunged to -22 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Celsius, with howling winds accelerating heat loss at rates that could induce hypothermia in under 30 minutes in an unprotected person. Even more challenging, these brutal conditions weren't a brief inconvenience, but a sustained reality lasting from October through April in many regions, nearly half the year spent in darkness and bitter cold. What made Viking winter nights particularly dangerous was the perfect storm of environmental factors they faced. The extended darkness of northern latitudes meant that in midwinter, sunlight might appear for just 4 to 6 hours daily in southern Scandinavia and disappear entirely above the Arctic Circle. This created a dangerous equation. Longer nights meant more hours, where body temperature naturally drops during sleep, precisely when external temperatures were at their most threatening. The margin between sleep and hypothermia was razor thin. Once core body temperature dipped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, clear thinking gave way to confusion. Drop just a few degrees more, below 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and consciousness itself began to fade. And with up to 50% of body heat lost through the head and another 30% through the limbs, every exposed inch became a liability. The Vikings didn't need modern science to understand the risks. They learned it the hard way. Water exacerbated these challenges in unexpected ways. The high humidity of coastal regions meant that cold air could steal body heat up to 25 times faster than dry air at the same temperature. Sweat from daily activities became a deadly liability at night, as moisture conducted heat away from the body far more efficiently than dry clothing or bedding. Even breathing presented a challenge. Each exhalation in extremely cold air represents a small but cumulative loss of body heat over an 8-hour sleep period. The Vikings endured it without the comforts we take for granted today. No Gore-Tex, no synthetic insulation, no electric warmth at the press of a button. Their survival depended on conserving every last calorie of body heat. This wasn't merely camping in cold weather, it was navigating a nightly tightrope walk between life and death, where sleep itself became both necessary for survival and potentially dangerous in its vulnerability. And yet, the Vikings found a way to make it work. The secret wasn't just in their sleep habits, it was built into the very structures they lived in. The Viking longhouse wasn't just an architectural style, it was a sophisticated survival machine disguised as a simple wooden structure. At first glance, these buildings appear primitive compared to modern construction, but their design incorporated an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics that modern passive house designers would recognize immediately. The typical Viking longhouse employed what engineers today would call a thermal envelope, a carefully considered barrier between the brutally cold outside world and the livable interior space. The most striking feature was the deliberate narrowness of these buildings, typically measuring just 16 to 18 feet or 5 to 6 meters wide, while stretching anywhere from 50 to 250 feet or 15 to 75 meters in length. This counterintuitive design choice minimized the surface area exposed to the elements while maximizing the interior space where heat could collect, essentially the same principle used in modern thermal flask design. The genius continued below ground level. Vikings typically dug their longhouse floors 3 to 4 feet or 1.2 meters below the Earth's surface, literally tapping into the planet's geothermal properties. While the surface might be locked in bitter frost, the Earth just a few feet down maintains a relatively stable temperature, around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in most of Scandinavia. This natural preheating provided a temperature boost of nearly 70 degrees Fahrenheit before any other warming methods were employed. Viking walls weren't just simple barriers. They were intricately designed, multi-layered systems that maximized insulation. The outer layer consisted of sturdy wooden planks, followed by a thick layer of clay mixed with straw, and then an inner wooden wall. This layered construction created dead air spaces, trapping heat effectively. Archaeological evidence suggests that in particularly cold regions, additional insulation layers of moss, animal hair, and even seaweed might be packed between these layers, creating an insulating system that could rival modern fiberglass in effectiveness. The roof design incorporated equally thoughtful elements. The steep pitch ensured that snow, a surprisingly effective insulator when not melting, would remain in place rather than sliding off. A properly snow-covered Viking longhouse roof could add an insulation layer with an estimated R value of 1.45 per inch of settled snow. In practical terms, 2 feet of accumulated snow could nearly double the roof's thermal resistance. Perhaps most ingenious was the central hearth system. Rather than placing fireplaces against exterior walls, where heat would be lost to the outside, Vikings positioned their hearths centrally along the longhouse's length. Stone slabs beneath and around these fire pits absorbed thermal energy during the evening cooking and socialization hours, then radiated this stored heat gradually throughout the night. The final component of Viking shelter design wasn't architectural, but social. Communal sleeping arrangements weren't just cultural, they were thermodynamic. By concentrating the entire household in the central sleeping area, often raised platforms running along the longhouse walls, they created a critical mass of body heat. A single sleeping human generates approximately 60 to 100 watts of heat, comparable to a small incandescent light bulb. A family of 6 to 8 people sleeping in close proximity could generate the equivalent of a 500-watt heater running continuously through the night, all without consuming any resources. But it didn't stop there. Their clothing and bedding systems were designed with the same precision, using materials that outperformed even modern gear in extreme cold. Wool formed the cornerstone of the Viking cold weather strategy, but this wasn't the scratchy, heavy wool we might imagine. Archaeological finds reveal that Viking wool was processed using techniques that created varying weights and textures, including a remarkably fine, soft variant used for items worn against the skin. What made their wool exceptional was its natural structure. Each fiber contains microscopic air pockets that trap body heat, creating insulation that functions even when wet. Modern testing of preserved Viking textiles shows they achieved insulation equivalent to modern 200 to 400 gram thinsulate, while maintaining better breathability. And while we're all out here relying on overpriced modern outdoor gear, the Vikings were layering like seasoned survivalists. Evidence suggests they typically employed 3 distinct layers: a moisture-wicking base layer, usually lightweight wool or linen, an insulating middle layer, heavier wool, sometimes doubled, and a wind-water-resistant outer layer, often wool treated with beeswax or animal fats to increase water repellency. This system created multiple heat-trapping air zones while addressing the critical challenge of moisture management. For sleeping, Vikings had it down to a science, starting with specialized night garments that kept them warm without cutting off circulation. Their most vital piece was the sleep cap, but not just any cap. These were hood-like setups that covered the head, neck, and shoulders, leaving only the face exposed. Bedding followed the same multi-layered logic. They slept on raised wooden platforms to avoid the frozen ground, piled with straw or hay for loft, then layered with sheepskins or furs, skin side down, fur side up, to wick moisture and trap heat. In brutal cold, they went full sleep system mode. The sleeper would wear wool from head to toe, including mittens and socks, then wrap in a fur-lined cloak before sliding between layers of wool blankets and furs. Then, it was into the bedding layers: wool blankets, furs, and a feather-stuffed pillow under a hood, leaving just the nose and mouth peeking out. It was primitive in appearance, but it worked with ruthless efficiency. Perhaps most impressive was their use of animal-specific materials based on their thermal properties. Reindeer fur, with its hollow hair shafts, provided the highest insulation-to-weight ratio. Seal skin, naturally water-resistant, was often used for moisture-prone areas. Bear fur, with its exceptional density and loft, frequently served as the outer layer of bedding. This wasn't just a fur fashion show. It was targeted thermoregulation through a sophisticated understanding of different materials' properties, developed through generations of trial and error in extreme conditions. However, The Vikings' approach to generating and preserving body heat throughout the frigid night wasn't simply about passive insulation. It was an active, multifaceted strategy that began long before bedtime and involved surprisingly sophisticated metabolic manipulation. The Viking pre-sleep routine started with the evening meal, carefully timed approximately 2 hours before sleep. This wasn't merely a cultural tradition, but a strategic metabolic decision. Archaeological analysis of cooking vessels and food remains reveals that winter evening meals were notably different from summer fare, higher in fats and proteins that would promote slower digestion and extended heat generation. A typical winter evening meal might include fatty fish, meat preserved in its own fat, and nutrient-dense broths that provided both hydration and calories without excessive liquid that would necessitate midnight trips outside. The composition of these meals was remarkably well suited to overnight thermogenesis, the production of heat through metabolic processes. Modern research confirms that protein digestion creates roughly 30% more thermogenic effect than carbohydrates, effectively turning the digestive system into an internal furnace that could generate heat for 6 to 8 hours after consumption. Fat metabolism, while slower to initiate, provides more sustained energy and heat output through the later portions of the night. The Vikings' protein and fat-heavy winter diet essentially programmed their bodies to generate heat precisely when they needed it most. Beverage choices played an equally important role. Evidence suggests that Vikings often consumed warm beverages containing herbs we now know to have vasodilatory effects, including meadowsweet and yarrow, which would increase blood flow to extremities before sleep. Perhaps counterintuitively, they appear to have limited evening alcohol consumption during the coldest months, despite their famous mead halls. Modern science explains why. While alcohol creates an initial sensation of warmth by dilating blood vessels near the skin, it ultimately accelerates heat loss and impairs the body's ability to regulate temperature during sleep. Physical activity immediately before sleep served as another heat-generating strategy. Archaeological evidence at multiple sites shows small confined spaces near sleeping areas with signs of high foot traffic, suggesting deliberate movement in limited areas, essentially ancient jumping jacks or jogging in place. This brief exertion would provide a crucial temperature buffer for the first hour of sleep, when the transition from activity to rest normally causes a temperature drop. The sleeping arrangements themselves reflected sophisticated understanding of collective heat management. Viking sleeping platforms typically measured about 5 to 6 feet or 1.5 to 1.8 meters wide. Insufficient for modern personal space standards, but ideal for heat conservation. Family members would sleep in close contact, often in spoon-like arrangements where each person's chest would warm the back of the person in front of them. The youngest children, most vulnerable to cold, would typically be positioned in the center of this human formation. But even their breathing wasn't left to chance. In sub-zero temperatures, each exhale carries away precious body heat and moisture. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings often slept with their heads slightly under covers, creating a microclimate where exhaled air would warm the small breathing pocket before being recirculated. This technique, later adopted by Arctic explorers, could raise the temperature of inhaled air by 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly reducing respiratory heat loss. Just as their bedding, clothing, and breathing were adapted to the cold, so too was the very structure of their sleep. Perhaps the most significant difference between Viking winter sleep and our modern expectations was their embrace of what chronobiologists now call biphasic sleep, or segmented sleep. Historical evidence, including linguistic analysis of Old Norse terminology around sleep, suggests Vikings typically experienced 2 distinct sleep periods during the long winter nights, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness lasting 1 to 2 hours. Rather than fighting against this natural pattern as we modern humans often do, the Vikings incorporated it into their cultural and survival practices. The typical winter sleep schedule would begin relatively early. Archaeological evidence of lighting use suggests most Vikings would begin their first sleep phase not long after sunset, which could be as early as 3 p.m. during the depths of winter in northern regions. This first sleep would last approximately 3 to 4 hours, followed by a period of wakeful activity in the middle of the night. This midnight waking wasn't viewed as insomnia or disrupted sleep, but as a normal expected interval with specific purposes. During this time, evidence suggests Vikings would engage in several important activities. They would stoke fires that had burned down, consume small amounts of preserved food to fuel ongoing thermogenesis, check on livestock housed in adjacent sections of the longhouse, and often engage in quiet craftwork or storytelling. The second sleep would then commence and continue until sunrise, which, depending on latitude and season, might not occur until 9 or 10 a.m. in midwinter. This biphasic pattern allowed for approximately 12 to 14 total hours of sleep during the longest winter nights, significantly more than the modern average of 7 to 8 hours, but appropriately aligned with the extended darkness. Modern research supports this pattern as a smart adaptation. Longer sleep during extreme cold helps the body recover from the constant work of staying warm. Similar sleep habits are still seen today in Arctic indigenous communities, not as hibernation, but as a natural response to environmental stress and limited daylight. Beyond their impressive technological and behavioral adaptations, the Viking populations themselves exhibited physiological characteristics that enhanced their capacity to endure extreme cold during sleep. Biological adaptations that emerged over generations of natural selection in one of Earth's most challenging thermal environments. The most significant physiological difference appears in their metabolic function. Skeletal analysis from Viking burial sites reveals bone density and muscle attachment patterns consistent with what modern medicine identifies as high thermogenic capacity, essentially an enhanced ability to generate internal heat. This wasn't magic, but a combination of several adaptations that collectively created more efficient cold weather humans. Studies of modern Scandinavians, many of whom carry Viking ancestry, shed light on how their bodies coped with cold during sleep. A key factor is the abundance of brown fat, which, unlike regular fat, burns energy to generate heat. People from colder regions tend to have more of it, particularly around the neck and shoulders, precisely where warmth is most needed during sleep. In freezing conditions, this brown fat acts like a mini space heater, producing heat without the need for shivering or waking. Their circulatory systems also show remarkable cold response capabilities. Viking remains indicate they had an enhanced ability to reduce blood flow to extremities while maintaining warmth in the core, an essential survival strategy for enduring icy nights without losing fingers or toes. Perhaps most impressive is their nervous system's adaptation to cold. Modern northern populations often report less discomfort in low temperatures, suggesting that their bodies don't perceive the cold as a threat, which minimizes sleep disruptions. Combined with larger nasal passages that warm air more efficiently, these features helped fine-tune their bodies, not just to survive in harsh conditions, but for deep, restorative sleep, even in the coldest environments.
Ever fired an arrow at a target and felt like a badass? Cute. Now imagine doing it with fingers so frostbitten they're turning black from the front of a storm-tossed ship, while men with axes are actively trying to kill you. That Viking archer you idolize from TV? The one calmly picking off enemies while looking majestic? Pure fantasy. Real Viking archers weren't heroes. They were walking calluses with permanent injuries who died young and painfully. The reality of being a Norse archer wasn't just hard. It was a daily exercise in agony that would break most modern humans before breakfast. And deep down, you know you wouldn't last a day. Your training started at 7, not with encouragement and safety gear, with pain. They'd hand you a bow, too heavy, obviously, and watch your arms shake as you tried to draw it. Fail? Get smacked. Cry? Get smacked harder. This wasn't about building your confidence. It was about breaking you into something useful. By 8, your fingertips were perpetually split open. The bowstring sliced through skin like a cheese wire through butter. Adults didn't give you bandages. They waited for calluses to form. Natural armor grown from your own suffering. But my fingers hurt wasn't a phrase in Old Norse. Neither was, I need a break, or this isn't fair. The only acceptable response was to shoot again, and again, until your arms trembled and your back spasmed. The draw weight of an adult Viking warbow wasn't the 30-pound toy you use at summer camp. Try 80 to 100 pounds. For perspective, that's like hanging a full-grown Rottweiler from your 3 drawing fingers, hundreds of times daily. By 12, you weren't practicing hitting targets. You were practicing hitting targets while standing in freezing water, while someone shouted in your face, while rocks were thrown at you. Because battle wouldn't be comfortable, so training couldn't be either. Miss too many shots. Enjoy spending hours in the dark collecting arrows while everyone else ate. Nothing teaches accuracy like the combination of hunger and hypothermia. Your modern CrossFit routine that makes you feel hardcore. Viking children would laugh at you between their sessions of finger-destroying, muscle-tearing archery practice, if they had the energy to laugh at all. And here's the real kicker. After years of this agony, after finally building those precious calluses and developing the muscles needed to function, you'd still regularly watch your fingers crack open in the winter cold, leaving bloody prints on your bow. And you'd still be expected to hit your target. Imagine trying to thread a needle while riding a horse during an earthquake in a blizzard. That's basically what shooting in Norse weather was like. Modern archers whine about a light breeze. Viking archers shot in sideways sleet that felt like glass shards against their faces. They drew bowstrings with hands so numb they couldn't feel if they were gripping an arrow or their own broken finger. Your bow, that precious weapon you'd spent months crafting, would soak up moisture and lose power in the rain. Your bowstring would get heavy and sluggish. Your arrows would warp. And you? You'd be expected to compensate for all of it, or die trying. Just wait for better weather wasn't a concept when raiders were storming your settlement. Storms didn't wait because your fingers were numb. You shot through it, or your family died. Simple as that. The sea made everything worse. Try maintaining your stance on a heaving deck while waves crash over you. Try keeping your bowstring dry when you're drenched in salt water. Try hitting a moving target from a moving ship in gale force winds. Now try it while someone's throwing spears at your face. Your wet wool clothing would freeze solid in the Nordic winter, turning you into a walking ice sculpture that somehow still needed to have the dexterity to release arrows with precision. Your leather armor would harden like cardboard, cracking at the joints and chafing your skin raw. Yet somehow, you were still expected to be the first line of attack, still expected to clear the beach before the landing, still expected to hit a man's eye socket from 30 paces while your body was in full hypothermic revolt. That compound bow with carbon fiber limbs and precision-machined cams you're so proud of? A Viking would trade it for a good meal and never think about it again, because they lived in a world where you made your weapon or you died. Finding the right wood was your first nightmare. Not just any tree would do. You needed yew, elm, or ash with straight grain and perfect density. Too young? Too flexible. Too old? Too brittle. Too wet? It'll warp. Too dry? It'll crack. And you weren't cutting it with a chainsaw and power tools. You were using an axe and hand knife, splitting the wood along the grain without modern measuring tools, eyeballing dimensions that needed to be precise to within millimeters. One mistake, one hidden knot in the wood. Start over. One moment of inattention while shaving down the limbs. Start over. Except starting over meant another full day of work with tools that were basically sharpened rocks compared to what you're used to. Your arrows weren't bought in bulk from Amazon. Each one was a personal project from hell. The shaft had to be perfectly straight, and they don't grow that way. You'd spend hours heating and straightening each one, knowing a warped arrow meant a missed shot, which often meant death. Fletching had to be perfect, cut from the right bird, split just right, glued at the ideal angle. Too much? It drops. Too little? It veers. Wrong angle? Useless. Even the bowstring was high stakes. Twisted sinew or plant fiber, tuned like a weapon. Too thick, it lags. Too thin, it snaps, and maybe blinds you. And after all that work, all those hours of precise, finger-splitting labor, you'd watch your arrows disappear into bodies or break against shields. You'd see your bowstrings snap in freezing temperatures. You'd feel your bow crack under the stress of battle. Then you'd start all over again, because in Viking archery, the crafting wasn't a hobby. It was survival. And you didn't get participation trophies. You got to live another day if you did it right. Forget that romantic image of archers safely launching arrows from behind shield walls. In Viking warfare, archer was practically code for expendable. You stood at the bow of the long ship as it approached shore. Not protected, not hidden, just you, fully exposed. A perfect target, while the real warriors crouched behind their shields, waiting for you to clear enough enemies for them to land safely. Imagine it. You're balancing on the narrow prow of a heaving ship, soaked to the bone, fingers numb, trying to hit moving targets on shore who are all aiming directly at you. Miss too many shots, and your entire crew might die before reaching land. No pressure. But surely once the battle starts, archers move to the back. That's adorable. Viking combat formations weren't built around protecting their ranged fighters, while other cultures figured out that keeping archers alive might be strategically sound. Norse warriors considered archer protection a waste of good shield carriers. Instead, you'd find yourself on the edges of the shield wall, partially exposed or worse, sent ahead as a scout. Translation: go die first so we can see where their strongest fighters are hiding. And you couldn't even wear proper armor. Heavy mail restricts movement and ruins your shooting form. So you'd enter battle in lighter leather protection that might stop a glancing blow, but would do absolutely nothing against a determined enemy with an axe. The bitter irony? When battles started going badly, everyone suddenly remembered how valuable archers were. Where are the archers? We need covering fire. Amazing how your status improved right before you were sacrificed to cover a retreat. Your life expectancy in direct combat wasn't calculated in battles survived. It was measured in minutes from first engagement. And your death wouldn't even merit a mention in the sagas. Just another archer who failed to survive the day. Movies show arrow wounds as clean, instant kills. The reality? A horror show of lingering agony that makes modern medical dramas look like children's cartoons. Let's start with your self-inflicted injuries, the ones that came with simply doing your job. That bowstring slapping against your forearm. It didn't just leave a cute red welt like in your weekend archery class. It literally flayed skin off in strips, leaving your arm looking like it had been attacked by a wolverine. Release a heavy draw-weight bow 100 times a day, and you'd watch your fingernails blacken and sometimes detach completely. No fancy release aids or modern gloves, just your calloused fingers and whatever pain tolerance you'd managed to develop. But enemy-inflicted injuries? That's where the real nightmare began. Take an arrow to your body, and you weren't dying heroically in seconds with time for last words. You were looking at days or weeks of fever, delirium, and agony as infection spread through your system like wildfire. Viking medical care would make torture look appealing by comparison. Arrow stuck in you? They'd either push it all the way through your body until the head emerged on the other side, or dig into your flesh with iron tools to extract it. All without anesthesia beyond maybe some ale if you were lucky. Arrowheads weren't just sharp, they were vicious. Many were barbed specifically so they couldn't be pulled out without shredding everything in their path. Some enemies even smeared their arrowheads with dirt, feces, or rotting matter to ensure infection. And if the arrow hit bone, it shattered it into fragments that worked their way through your body like tiny knives for years. If you survived the initial injury and resulting infection, you'd carry those bone shards until they either worked their way out through your skin or killed you when they reached something vital. The worst part? After surviving an injury that would send any modern human into shock, you were expected to recover quickly. No physical therapy, no disability pay, no medical leave. Just get back to shooting as soon as you could draw a bow again, usually before your wounds had fully healed. Your body eventually became a map of scars, chronic pain, and half-healed injuries, and that was considered normal. The natural state of a Viking who had chosen the bow as his weapon of choice. And if you'd think mastering a weapon that required years of painful training would earn you status equal to the sword swingers, you'd be wrong. In the brutal hierarchy of Viking society, archers occupied a strange limbo. Skilled enough to be valuable, common enough to be expendable, like a medieval unpaid intern with PTSD. At feasts, the seating arrangements told the whole story. Sword warriors near the Jarl, sharing mead and boasts. Axemen not far behind. You? Somewhere near the dogs, grateful for scraps of recognition thrown your way like bones. Tell us again how you killed that Saxon from 50 paces away, they'd occasionally ask, not because they were impressed, but because distance killing lacked the prestige of face-to-face combat. Your kills weren't counted the same. Your stories weren't worthy of skald songs. The loot distribution after raids was even more telling. The ship owner got first pick, the captain second, the sword warriors third. By the time it reached the archers, you were choosing between a dented pot and a half-broken comb. Feeling valued yet? The cruel irony? When battles started, your value skyrocketed like beachfront property. Suddenly you were essential, right until the moment you weren't needed. Or worse, until you were dead. And if you died, your funeral wouldn't merit the elaborate rituals reserved for real warriors. Your bow might be passed down, but your name wouldn't be. Another archer was already being trained to replace you, like changing a broken wheel on a cart. Your greatest legacy wasn't glory. It was survival knowledge passed to the next generation of arrow fodder, teaching them which fingers to sacrifice to frostbite first when the choice became inevitable. Your modern 40-hour work week with weekends off, a Viking archer would laugh until blood came out their nose. When not in battle, which wasn't often, you were hunting. Not for fun, for survival. Missed too many shots, and it wasn't just your pride that suffered. It was everyone's belly. Between hunting trips came the endless equipment maintenance. That painstaking gear required constant attention, like a needy child with sharp edges. Your bowstring needed regular waxing and replacement. Your arrows needed inspection and repair after each use. Your bow required oils and resins to maintain flexibility without cracking. Skip maintenance for a couple days? Congratulations on your upcoming funeral. Training never ended. Ever. Even veteran archers with decades of experience practiced daily. Miss a few days, and your muscles would begin to atrophy, unable to handle the massive draw weights required in battle. Your calluses would soften. Your eye would lose its edge. In the archery game, there were no days off, only days you weren't dead yet. Sleep. That luxury was for people who weren't responsible for everyone's survival. During raids or when threats loomed, archers pulled double duty as night sentries. Your keen eyes were useful for more than just shooting. They were for watching the darkness for approaching enemies. Your body was never whole, always sporting fresh injuries alongside healing wounds and old scars. Your shoulders and back developed chronic pain from repetitive stress that would make modern physical therapists weep. Your hands remained permanently damaged, with fingers that couldn't fully straighten and nails that grew back deformed, if at all. And the reward for all this endless suffering and work? The privilege of waking up tomorrow to do it all again, assuming you survived that long. Let's cut through the heroic nonsense. You, watching this on your phone while sitting somewhere comfortable, would collapse before completing a Viking archer's morning routine. Being a Viking archer wasn't some cool aesthetic for Instagram. It wasn't a weekend hobby or an interesting conversation starter. It was a brutal, thankless existence of constant pain, danger, and labor that usually ended with an agonizing death far from home, probably from an infected wound that modern antibiotics would clear up in a week. So could you do it? Could you handle the training that began with bleeding and only got worse? Could you function while freezing, hungry, and in constant pain? Could you accept being essential in battle but overlooked in victory? Could you craft perfection with primitive tools knowing your life depended on it? Or are you just another soft modern human who romanticizes a past you wouldn't survive a single day in? Tell me in the comments which would break you first: the training, the battle, or the complete absence of basic human comfort. Want more brutal reality checks about history's most misunderstood warriors? Subscribe for weekly doses of historical truth that'll make you pathetically grateful for antibiotics and indoor heating. And speaking of heating, ever wondered how Viking peasants managed to survive those brutal, unforgiving winters without modern heating?